As we continue on in our homeostasis notes, we are talking about all the things that living organisms need to take care of in order to stay alive, in order to maintain homeostasis, comparing it between different types of organisms. So the last topic we talked about was nutrition, gaining nutrients through absorbing materials. The next topic is related because most living things require oxygen if they use aerobic respiration. And so they need to obtain oxygen from their environment. And this can happen in a few different ways. So we'll talk about a bunch of different organisms. We'll focus more on humans, but we'll sort of compare the two. So plants. We already learned quite a bit about plants and gas exchange. So just as a reminder, how do plants take in most of their oxygen? Yeah, through the stomates, through those openings that are typically in leaves that allow gases to enter the interior parts of the leaf where it's needed for photosynthesis. So the stomates are how most of that oxygen enters into the leaf. Goes into the spongy layer, into the palisade layer where most photosynthesis takes place. But there are also some other ways of getting oxygen into the plant. You know what type of tree this is? Yeah, that's a birch tree. And lots of trees have this, cherries and others. If you look closely at the bark, have you seen these lines? You may not recognize them, but on many smooth barked trees, you can see these lines. They're called lenticels. And actually, they're sort of porous tissue that allows some oxygen to get into the other parts of the plant. So they have those sort of areas in which oxygen can diffuse in. Also, the root hairs. When plant roots grow, the newly growing roots have these tiny, very fine hairs growing to maximize surface area for diffusion of water and nutrients, but also for some oxygen to diffuse in. How about bacteria, protists, fungi? How do you think bacteria or protists obtain oxygen? Any idea? I don't know, lungs. Carter? It just diffuses in. So because they're single-celled organisms and they're not very large, basically they just absorb oxygen through the cell membrane. Talk about animals. Different types of animals obtain oxygen in different ways. An animal like the Hydra, pretty simple, relatively small. It's only really the wall of its body is only a couple cells thick, and it lives in the water. So basically the entire Hydra, almost every cell is in contact with the water. So again, it can just absorb oxygen through diffusion through the cell membranes. Basically the whole Hydra can absorb that oxygen. Larger animals, animals that live on land, need other adaptations to obtain oxygen. One example is the earthworm that we're going to come back to throughout this unit. Earthworm has skin that's moist, which allows for the diffusion of gases in from the outside directly into the blood. And one interesting thing about earthworms is they don't have red blood cells to carry oxygen like many other animals do. Instead, the hemoglobin, which grabs onto the oxygen, is just in their blood plasma. Okay? So it's still their blood that's carrying this oxygen, just happens sort of in a little bit different way. And then the capillaries of their body are in contact with all their cells to allow for oxygen exchange. Insects like the grasshopper have specialized respiratory system. On the side of the grasshopper, for example, you see these little dots on the abdomen in each segment, those are called spiracles. Basically, it's a little opening that leads into these tubes. Okay? So this is the opening, leads into these tubes called tracheal tubes that then feed oxygen to the various cells in different parts of the grasshopper. Here you can see the spiracles on this caterpillar, these lines here. Those are those little openings that allow gas exchange. So they don't breathe through their head, they breathe through those openings in the side of their body. And that feeds directly to the muscles. So the insects, actually, their blood is not carrying the oxygen and carbon dioxide. It's just being exchanged directly with their environment. So that's a little unique as well. Fish. Another example of animal. Fish have gills. Obviously, gills are adapted to obtaining oxygen from the water. Gills are very fine and sort of delicate. They have a very large surface area, and that's important to maximize the absorption of oxygen from the water. So here are fish gills sort of out of the fish. You can see all that little structure that gives them that surface area. They don't work outside of the water because they basically just collapse. There are all these fine little tissues, and out of the water, without the water supporting them, they just sort of collapse on each other, and the fish cannot absorb oxygen. They need a constant flow of water over them in order for them to obtain the oxygen they need from the water. That's why when you look at a fish, it's always opening its mouth. It forces water in its mouth, over its gills, and out through the side. Okay? This is called the operculum, this flap that helps protect the gills. So fish take in that water through their mouth, passes over the gills and out. Along the way, the gills are able to absorb that oxygen. So humans have a full respiratory system and respiratory organs. The end of as we inhale air, goes through various passageways, but eventually ends up in these clusters, these little air sacs. Kind of looks like a head of broccoli or something. Each of those little circular air sacs fills with air. They're called alveoli. And as they fill with air, oxygen can then diffuse into capillaries that are surrounding them. At the same time, carbon dioxide from our blood can diffuse into that air that we exhale. So here's what the lungs actually look like. So they're not like balloons that just inflate. It's not like a hollow bag. It's actually all these tiny little branches and alveoli are what make up the bulk of our lungs. So as humans breathe in, we can obviously breathe through our nose or our mouth. They connect in the pharynx. The nasal cavity, you may have heard it's better to breathe through your nose. That's because we have lots of nose hairs in our nasal cavity. We have lots of mucus there. And all of that is to help filter out contaminants from the air, dust, bacteria, particles, so that the air that gets into our lungs is free of those things. The back of the pharynx, or the throat, contains some lymphatic tissue, like your tonsils and adenoids. Also, there is the vocal cords, the voice box, okay, which are located in the respiratory system. The tube that carries the air down into our chest cavity is the trachea, sometimes called the windpipe. It's pretty strong because it has these rings of cartilage sort of reinforcing it. It's important that the trachea stays intact and open. If the trachea closes for some reason, we can't breathe. Obviously, that's dangerous. So a person has a severe allergic reaction, then their trachea can start to constrict and they can't get oxygen into their lungs. If there's physical damage to the trachea, then obviously same sort of situation. If a piece of food gets stuck in the trachea, that's choking, again, So it's important for the trachea to remain intact. You could also see that it's the trachea is in front of the esophagus. So two separate tubes. One carries food to the stomach, one carries air into the lungs. There's a flap of tissue that covers the trachea so that when we swallow food, when we drink something, it doesn't go into the trachea. It doesn't work perfectly. Sometimes food can get trapped there, sometimes water can get in there, and then you start coughing. Coughing is your body's adaptation to expel material from the trachea because it can be dangerous. As air comes down the trachea, it branches off into two sides because we have two lungs, a left and a right lung. Those two main branches are called the bronchi. And they continue to branch off and get smaller and more narrow into what we call bronchioles. These are the smaller branches. And those smaller branches, those bronchioles, eventually end in those air sacs, in those alveoli. Our lungs contain about 300 million of those tiny little air sacs, those alveoli. They're just the cells that make up that tissue. They're just a single cell that allowing for material to easily diffuse across that surface. They don't have any muscle tissue. So our lungs on their own can't breathe in and out. You can't like contract your lungs. Instead, in order to inhale and exhale, we have a special muscle that helps us to do that. It's called the diaphragm. The diaphragm is located at the bottom of your rib cage. It sort of seals off your chest cavity from your abdominal cavity. It's a sheet of muscle. And the way that the diaphragm works is we can voluntarily contract our diaphragm, and that's when we inhale. So as the diaphragm contracts and tightens up, okay, it drops down, and that creates a vacuum in our chest cavity, lower pressure in our chest cavity. There's higher pressure outside in the air, and so high pressure forces air into our lungs, because we reduce the pressure and our lungs inflate. As we relax our diaphragm, the opposite happens. It forms higher pressure in our chest cavity, and therefore we exhale that air. So the diaphragm is what allows us to inhale and exhale. It can get temporarily stunned. What do we call that? Got the wind knocked out of you? Yeah, if you fall or somebody rams into you playing a soccer game or somebody punches you in the back, it can temporarily stun your diaphragm so you can't breathe for 5 or 10 seconds, and it's scary because you feel like you're never going to be able to breathe again, but it goes away fairly quickly, and then you can breathe. If you get the hiccups, okay, that's an involuntary sort of spasm of the diaphragm, which causes. So as far as some breakdowns in the respiratory system, some diseases, conditions, some you're probably familiar with, bronchitis. Bronchitis is basically an infection in the bronchi. So if you have a bacterial infection, a viral infection, fluids, mucus can build up in the bronchi, and that restricts the flow of air, interferes with normal breathing. You're coughing all the time, and that's what bronchitis is, inflammation in those bronchi. Okay? It can happen in different parts of the bronchi. Okay? Typically due to, like I said, a virus, a pathogen, bacteria. Asthma, we talked about. So here we have what's a normal, healthy airway. So these are those bronchioles, okay, leading here to an alveoli. These smooth muscles sort of ring around the those bronchioles. Now, in normal asthma, in a person that has asthma, those interior portions of those bronchioles may be inflamed, may be constricted somewhat. And so just on a normal day-to-day basis, it's a little bit harder to breathe. It's a little bit harder to get air into the lungs. During times when there's actually an asthma attack, a severe situation where a person really can't breathe, not only is that wall of the bronchioles inflamed, but then these muscles around the bronchioles start to constrict. And that further constricts the airway, making it even more difficult to inhale and exhale. So a bronchodilator that a person with asthma might take helps to relax those muscles, helps to open up those airways to improve the flow of blood, or flow of air into the alveoli. Lung capacity, our lab that we're going to do today or tomorrow is about lung capacity. We'll look at it in a minute because I got a graph I'll show you. Another lung disease, pneumonia, right, is caused by sort of the buildup of fluid in those alveoli. So normally they're free of fluid. Okay, they can fill with air fully, allowing for maximum exchange of oxygen. However, fluid starts to build up in those lungs. Sometimes bacteria or other viruses can cause the buildup of that fluid. Obviously, if there's fluid in those alveoli, then they can't absorb as much oxygen as they normally would. More difficult to breathe, more difficult to get the oxygen that we need. So it's basically inflammation and accumulation of material inside of those alveoli. Other respiratory malfunctions, emphysema. Emphysema is when the alveoli sort of lose their normal elasticity. And it's more difficult to breathe. These alveoli don't come back to their normal shape after they fill with oxygen. So often it can be due to smoking or other contaminants, can lead to damage to the alveoli. And basically it's sort of cumulative. And so as emphysema gets worse and worse, you're losing more and more of the lung capacity, so it's more difficult to get the oxygen that you need. Cancer, lung cancer is one of the most common types of cancer. This is incorrect. It's not the most common type of cancer. But lung cancer, typically risk factors, smoking is the biggest one. Okay, because of the compounds that are in tobacco, some of those are carcinogens, which cause cells to start to become cancerous. And as we just learned in mitosis, cancer is basically just the cells losing their normal ability to regulate the cell cycle. Other materials as well, asbestos, if you've ever heard of that, is a material that was found often in insulation that they used in buildings in 50s, 60s, 70s. They later found that it caused asbestos fibers could be inhaled, and when they got into the lungs, they caused lung cancer in the long term. So it had to be removed from schools and so forth to make sure it doesn't become airborne. And again, you could see changes to the lungs due to smoking. So the buildup of tar and other materials, damage to the lung, leads to a compromise in lung tissue. Oh, so lung capacity, when we're not really thinking about it, we obviously inhale and exhale. It gets us enough oxygen to maintain all of our cells. And that's called, the amount of air that we inhale and exhale in our normal breathing is called our tidal volume. Something we're going to measure in our lab. And so normally you're not breathing very deeply, and you're not exhaling very deeply just as you're going about your day. Of course, now that I'm talking about it, you're probably thinking about it, and it feels weird, and because we can control our breathing when we want to, or we can leave it to sort of autonomous control of our brain. But once you start thinking about it, you go, oh, should be breathing in too deep, and then it just feels weird. So typically, your body takes over. You can force more air out of your lungs. You can inhale deeper and fill your lungs with more air. And so the maximum amount of air that you can inhale and exhale, it's called your vital capacity. You can actually never quite exhale all of the air in your lungs. You can't get rid of it. Even in your deepest exhale, there's still some air left in those alveoli. It's called the residual volume. So this graph sort of shows that during normal respiration, as we inhale and exhale, if we force a very deep breath, our lung capacity grows dramatically. And then as we have a large exhale, then it drops lower than normal, then we can return back to normal. So you can change your lung capacity. Exercise training can change your lung capacity. If you exercise a lot, if you play an instrument, or if you sing and you're working on your breathing, you can enhance your lung capacity. They have tools. People sometimes with emphysema or asthma might have something like this. I've never seen these.
Yeah, I use that.
So there's different tools like this. So if you're going to the doctor and maybe you're having trouble breathing, they're trying to diagnose asthma, they have an electronic version where you basically breathe in and out, take deep breath, inhale, exhale, and this machine measures sort of these factors about your lung capacity. Or a peak flow meter. So my oldest daughter Taylor used to go for allergy shots when she was a little bit younger. Every time she went to the doctor, he would have her use this peak flow meter. It's this little thing, then you just exhale as hard as you can, and it gives you a range. And it's an indication of sort of how bad your allergies are. Because if your allergies are sort of acting up, your peak flow is lower. And if they're not acting up, it's higher. This is called an incentive spirometer. So you might get one of these to practice with to help improve your lung capacity. The way this works, you've used the same one?
Yeah, when I had pneumonia.
Okay. Yeah, so if you're recovering, so if you have asthma, you might use it. People recovering from an illness like pneumonia, people that had lung surgery where the doctor wants them to expand their lung capacity, they might use something like this. So the way this works is you hold it up, you have to inhale. There's a little marker that says like good, let's say good, better, best, and you're supposed to inhale not quickly, but slowly to keep this little float thing in the good or better, best range. Well, you're also, this measures sort of how much air you're taking in. So you use it like, and you're supposed to hold that air in. You could breathe. If you did it, you could do it like that, but that's not the point. And so it measures your lung capacity and so forth. Do you remember that? Like, did you have a hard time getting it?
Well, yeah, I mean, I usually just like ignored the good by best. I just tried to get as high as I could. Like at first, I could barely get above like 500, 700.
Really, down here?
Yeah, like down there, and then eventually I like, went up to like a 1250. I was like, yeah, like new record. And,
yeah, so
it was hard.
Like it may seem like if you're just healthy and you have no problem, like it may seem like, oh yeah, I can get all the way up there. But if you have fluid built up in your alveoli, your lung capacity can be drastically decreased, or you can hardly get it up there. So this is the sort of thing that helps you increase your lung capacity. I know we have a lot of musicians there. Anyone work on lung capacity with an instrument? Like, is that something they talk about? No? Like if it's a hold a long note? Like the greater your lung capacity is, the longer you can hold a note, right? If you've ever been singing or playing a note and like you're getting to the end of your lung capacity, you're like trying to hold your note the right amount of time, but if your lung capacity is compromised, you're unable to do that. All right. Any questions about the respiratory system?